So Deuteronomy chapter 23, we're going to talk about what does it take to join the group of Israel, the congregations basically. What are some of the rules around that? What about sanitation? What about making promises and vows to other people? We're going to have some fun talking about these today. So verse 1, he that is wounded in the stones or hath his privy member cut off shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. That is talking about genital mutilation or castration, basically, becoming a eunuch, if you will. So if somebody is basically a eunuch or have their genitals mutilated, they're not allowed in. So they're like, nope, you can't do that. And I think that's partly because of some of the traditions of some of the other groups in the area would do rituals and things, and so they're like, nope, you can't join us. Now, verse 2, a bastard shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to his 10th generation shall he not enter into the congregation of the Lord. Now, this is somebody who is a illegitimate child, basically. Verse 3, an Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. Now, you could look up in the Bible dictionary, Gentile also is referenced here with these. But remember, they had some challenges with the Ammonites and Moabites. It was different from the other groups around them. So we're going to learn about some of these other groups, in fact, here in a second. Verse 4, because they met you not with bread and with water in the way, when ye came forth out of Egypt, and because they hired against thee Balaam, the son of Beor, of Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse thee. So they actively tried to destroy Israel, not necessarily fight Israel, but actually pervert Israel. And they weren't very nice to Israel, basically. So they tried to get Israel cursed and get God to hate him, basically. Verse 5, nevertheless, the Lord thy God would not hearken unto Balaam, but the Lord thy God turned the curse into a blessing unto thee, because the Lord thy God loved thee. Thou shalt not seek their peace nor their prosperity all thy days forever. So Ammonites and Moabites, nope, you don't do anything with them. You don't deal with them. They're going to be punished, basically, severely because of what they tried to do. Now, verse 7, thou shalt not abhor an Edomite, for he is thy brother. Thou shalt not abhor an Egyptian, because thou wast a stranger in his land. So we're going to learn a couple things here that's really interesting, okay? So Hugh Nibley talks about in his book, Approaching Zion, chapter 7, he says, you must recognize any kindness shown you by others. Thus Israel is not to despise the Edomite or the Egyptian, though both of these had opposed and oppressed Israel, because Israel was permitted to pass through their lands in spite of everything. So remember, Edomites are still a cousin of Jacob's brother Esau. So they are cousins, distant cousins of the Israelites, basically. And they let them pass. They said, fine, you can go past, we're okay. The Egyptians, even though the Egyptians oppressed Israel, still they didn't necessarily try to destroy them. So if they treat you nicely, you need to recognize that and be okay with that. So don't abhor them, basically. Now, verse 8, the children that are begotten of them shall enter into the congregation of the Lord in their 3rd generation. So they can be brought in as well. So Edomites and Egyptian children, if you intermarry, basically, they can be brought in, but it'll take 3 generations to allow them in. Whereas the Ammonites, remember, the Moabites, not even to the 10th generation can they be brought in. Which if you go in genealogy about 10 generations back, it's really hard. Like you're kind of related to everybody at that point, because everybody's connected to everybody else pretty close by about that point. So here in the Institutes of Biblical Law, they talk about this. The grounds for exclusion are significant. Edom met Israel with open, honest enmity, and Egypt worked to destroy them. But Ammon and Moab instead worked to pervert Israel. After Israel showed them forbearance, Edom and Egypt sought to kill Israel. Ammon and Moab tried to pervert and degrade Israel, and their judgment was accordingly severe. So that's important. Now, also with this, in another quote from Institutes of Biblical Law talking about this ban. The ban was not on faith, i.e., it is not stated that those listed in here cannot be believers. There is, in fact, a particularly strong promise of blessing to believing eunuchs in Isaiah 56, and their place as proselytes was real even in the era of hardened Phariseeism, as Acts 8 will attest to. The Moabitess Ruth intermarried twice, first with the son of Naomi, then with Boaz, to become an ancestress of Jesus Christ. So she was a Moabitess, one of those groups that you're not supposed to mess with. There is no reason to doubt that eunuchs or illegitimate children or Ammonites or Moabites regularly became believers and were faithful worshippers of God. Congregation has reference to the whole nation in its governmental function as God's covenant people. G. Ernest Wright defined it as the whole organized commonwealth as it assembled officially for various purposes, particularly worship. The men of the legitimate bloodline constituted the heads of houses and of tribes. These men were the congregation of Israel, not the women and children nor excluded persons. All the integrity and honesty required by the law was due to every stranger, and it was certainly not denied to a man's illegitimate child, nor to a eunuch, an Ammonite, or a Moabite. The purpose of the commandment is here the protection of authority. Authority among God's people is holy. It does require a separateness. It does not belong to every man simply on the ground of his humanity. So we're not talking about people joining the children of Israel. You can join the children of Israel. You can be a believer in God. There's no restrictions on that. When they talk about joining the congregation, this is about the people who are the rulers. You can't hold public office in Israel unless you meet these specific criteria. That's what it's talking about. So you can't have a Moabite or an Edomite or an illegitimate child or a eunuch. They're not allowed to hold official office. They can't be in public office or be a part of the government of Israel, basically. That's what it's talking about in here, basically. All right, now verse 9, let's move on. When the host goeth forth against thine enemies, then keep thee from every wicked thing. So this is another important part of their strategies of war, is when the army goes out to fight, the nation should stay free from sin. Why would that help? Because God will help the people out. If they're keeping the commandments, God will help. If they're not keeping the commandments, God's not going to help them. Verse 10, if there be among you any man that is not clean by reason of uncleanness, that chanceth him by night, then shall he go abroad out of the camp. He shall not come within the camp. But it shall be when evening cometh on, he shall wash himself with water. When the sun is down, he shall come into the camp again. So again, talking about uncleanness, sometimes things happen where you become unclean. You're dealing with a dead animal. There's other things we learned in the book of Leviticus that talk about when you become unclean. If that happens, you come across somebody who's unclean and you touch them or mess with their garments or stuff, you're unclean. You need to go outside the camp, wait till the evening, basically, and then wash yourself and wash your clothes. And then at dusk, basically, when the sun goes down, you can come back in the camp. So that's what that's talking about. Just reiterating what we discussed more in Leviticus. Now, verse 12, thou shalt have a place also without the camp, whither thou shalt go forth abroad. And thou shalt have a paddle upon thy weapon, and it shall be when thou wilt ease thyself abroad, thou shalt dig therewith, and shalt turn back and cover that which cometh from thee. For the Lord thy God walketh in the midst of thy camp, to deliver thee, and to give up thine enemies before thee. Therefore shall thy camp be holy, that he see no unclean thing in thee, and turn away from thee. So this is kind of talking about, again, hygiene. So you keep a shovel with you. If you've got to do your business, you go outside the camp, you dig a hole, you do your business, you bury it, basically. So you don't do it in the middle of the town. You don't leave excrement around in town, basically. So hygiene is important. Cleanliness and hygiene is important to God. And since God does dwell within you and walk in the midst of the camp, you need to have a holy place. You can't have excrement and other stuff around, basically. Verse 15, thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place which he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him. So Hugh Nibley, in his book Approaching Zion, talks about the word tonanu for this, means not grumble about, mutter under your breath, or complain about, when it talks about oppress. So if a servant escapes his master and you find him, he can live with you, basically, and you can't complain about him, basically. If he likes if he likes living with you or where he's at, you can't complain about it, basically. So you can, if he likes your area, your land, basically. Verse 17, there shall be no whore of the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite of the sons of Israel. So again, it's no people, okay, sexual immorality is banned and really, really bad. It still is to this day. But there's none of that happens, basically. Now, verse 18, thou shalt not bring thine hire of a whore or the price of a dog into the house of the Lord thy God for any vow, for even both these are abomination unto the Lord thy God. Excuse me. So the word dog here is not saying that you sold a dog. The word dog is a contemptuous term for males who either were prostitutes themselves or profited from prostitution. So you can't be a prostitute or a pimp. Thus, no money gained from prostitution or homosexuality, which is a sodomite, could be used as offerings to God. So that's what they're talking about here. When you bring them into, into the house of the Lord, the price of a dog into the house of the Lord. So if you got money, okay, from immorality, God will not accept that as an offering. You can't use that money as an offering at all, basically. All right, verse 19. Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother. Usury of money, usury of victuals or food, usury of anything that is lent upon usury. Unto a stranger thou mayest lend upon usury, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all that thou settest thine hand to in the land whither thou goest to possess it. Now, usury means interest. So if your neighbor comes to you, if a fellow Israelite comes to you and says, hey, I need help with this, can you help me with this? Can I get some food from you? Or, can I borrow a cup of sugar? Or can I borrow some money from you to go get something or whatever? You can't lend with interest to your neighbor, basically to the other Israelites, because you need to be helpful. You need to be charitable to people and be willing to help other people out. Again, people are more important than stuff. However, with a stranger, you can lend with interest, is what he's saying here, basically, but not Israelites, basically, is what that comes down to. Verse 21, when thou shalt vow a vow unto the Lord thy God, thou shalt not slack to pay it. For the Lord thy God will surely require it of thee, and it would be sin in thee. But if thou shalt forbear to vow, it shall be no sin in thee. That which is gone out of thy lips, thou shalt keep and perform, even a freewill offering, according as thou hast vowed unto the Lord thy God, which thou hast promised with thy mouth. So again, if you make a vow or a promise, you need to take care of that promise immediately. Don't delay resolving what you said didn't agree to do, basically. If you delay making the promise, then there's no sin necessarily in that. So be careful getting into contracts or promises and things, and make sure you fulfill it quickly and don't be slothful about it, basically, is a lot of what that's coming down to. Now, verse 24, when thou comest into thy neighbor's vineyard, then thou mayest eat grapes thy fill at thine own pleasure, but thou shalt not put any in thy vessel. So this is an important point here is when you are a traveler, you're a wanderer, the Savior even brought this point up and talked about when you go out and plow your field, you shouldn't go back a second time. You go to your field, you do your best to gather all of your crops together, but leave anything that you don't gather the first time because that is for the poorer people and strangers. Okay, they didn't have grocery stores where you could just go buy food anytime. They didn't have necessarily restaurants back then. So if you were traveling through the area, you just had the land. You just had whatever you found, basically. So if you came across a farmer's field and there was a little bit of a corner of their field that still had grain, you can then go pick it and eat the grain berries to help give you sustenance. So they're talking about here, if you come across somebody else's fields or their vineyards or their crops, okay, you can eat some of it. So they're not, you can't, it's not like, oh, that's my property, don't ever touch it. You can't eat of it. You need to be free with, the Lord wanted people to be free with their food, with their resources, basically. But you can't put some in a vessel and take it with you. So you can grab some of the grapes and eat them in your hand, but you're not allowed to put it in a bag or a pouch or a container of any kind and take them with you. So you can eat them while you're there, but that's it. So there is a line, okay? The farmers need to be willing to allow people who are traveling through the area to eat some of their food, but there's a line that says you don't have to give them everything, just give them a little bit. And the people that are the travelers, you can eat, but you can't take it with you, basically, because that would be again imposing the wrong way on each other. So verse 25 is a similar, when thou comest into the standing corn of thy neighbor, then thou mayest pluck the ears with thine hand, but thou shalt not move a sickle unto thy neighbor's standing corn. So you can grab the corn with your hand, pull off a head of corn and eat that, but you can't use like a knife to like cut them all down and get them all off. So again, that would be taken too far. That would be taking advantage of your neighbor. And so you can be helped by your neighbor's efforts. He's got food, you need food, you can be helped by him, but you can't take too much. That would be inappropriate, basically. So some good rules and good guidance to realize principles even that we could follow today. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments, and we look forward to seeing you in the next chapter as we continue to learn from Moses. We're getting into this. This is kind of, if you notice, we're doing a bit more rules type stuff. So this is what I believe is the second lecture that Moses gave to the children of Israel. He's kind of reiterating some of the laws a little bit. He talked about the first lecture was more about the past, more about what they have done, where they have come from, and now we're getting into more of just reiterating some of these principles and laws. And then towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy, we're going to get a little bit more to the next one where he finishes up his speeches and they get into the promised land. So we'll see you in the next chapter.